Hello everybody, welcome to Google, welcome to Noisy Thinking for our third of this year's series. I'm Sarah Newman, I'm the director of the APG, and I'm going to start with a few very important thank yous. The first is to Google for hosting us once again in this lovely venue, providing us with delicious drinks and the chance for a chat. We're really grateful for all your hard work. Thanks also to Flamingo, our wonderful sponsor, with whom none of these provocative and hopefully interesting evenings would happen. And thanks also to Tracy Follows, the APG chair, who inspired this evening's theme and who sadly can't be here this evening. But we'll see her soon. It's interesting for me to be up on the stage talking about this, if in brief, because I'm not a speaker but an introducer, because I'm very pleased that we're giving lots of oxygen to what is a very important topic. But I'm kind of horrified that in 2014 we're still having this conversation. Many years ago, 20 years ago I think, when I was at Ogilvy and I was a young planner, I was very involved in a big research project we did amongst women to try and get rid of the whole idea of the housewife, to take the housewife off the brief and out of the planning thinking, as we felt it was so inhibiting to really good advertising that connected with women. And the research project felt very groundbreaking. We did a great conference, got lots of publicity. Some things changed. But I wonder whether enough has changed, and I wonder why we are still dealing in so many of the cliches around women, which are so well worn, and why we're so lazy sometimes in our thinking. So, ever vigilant as the APG, we thought we'd give lots of oxygen to this subject this evening, and it kind of goes well with the themes that we've had so far this year, as we've talked about what makes a good insight and what makes a good brief. And the target audience is a fundamental part of all of our thinking. So tonight it's about women. And we're very lucky to have four fantastic speakers. The first on this evening is Jane Cunningham, former planning director of Ogilvy and my boss.
Still am, Sarah.
I know, I'm absolutely terrified. She's co-founder, as many of you know, with Philippa Roberts of Inside Her Pretty Little Head, which is a consultancy devoted to helping brands and clients connect better with women. And she's going to be setting the scene by talking about how companies targeting men tend to have a culture that leaches into their communications and some of the ways that you can go around that. Rachel Pashley, planning group head at JWT, who works primarily on women's healthcare with JWT and travels all around the world talking to women and understanding more about them, and has used a lot of that thinking, plus some very interesting research she's done, to inform her work on female tribes. Kate Smither, who's a relatively new import to these shores, having worked in Australia most of her life as a planner, who is multi-awarded for her work on Dove and a number of other brands, and who's going to talk to us this evening about how you can get it right and what we might learn from that. And finally, Mr. Richard Huntington, Head of Strategy at Saatchi & Saatchi, and no stranger to this stage, whose recent study in association with Mumsnet is designed to make the use of the word mum entirely redundant. Marvellous. But not mums. No, let's not do that. OK, so Jane, would you like to come off and kick off the evening?
Have your phone just to...
Oh, the sofa.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And just to clarify, nobody has ever been Sarah's boss, least of all me. Great. Well, it's really nice to be here, and it's really brilliant for this subject to be discussed. Embarrassingly, the first slide is of the book that we wrote, which it isn't really supposed to be there, but there are some free books on the table at the end if you'd like to take one. But the reason that we wrote the book really is because we had observed, as lots of you will have observed, that advertising can be very alienating to women. Oh, here's a whole lift full of people arriving. Managed to work out how the lift worked right. Okay, but I think what we would say is that, all advertising doesn't alienate all women, but there are some categories that are really, really good at alienating women. And those categories tend to be, we would say, financial services, technology, automotive, and alcohol clients. Most of you, I guess, will have relationships with some or all of those types of organizations. And the reasons that those people are really, or those marketing people tend to be bad at or good at alienating women is because, not because they're idiots or because they're sexist. And we spend a lot of time talking to people in these organizations. And it's not because they're really ignorant even. it's really because they're using the wrong tools for the job. And what they're doing is they're taking marketing tools that have been designed traditionally to target men, and they're redeploying them without any kind of modification in order to then try and attract a female audience. And that's because there's an underlying assumption in these organizations. The theme in the book is tools. It's not a kind of just random crass joke. Anyway, so but the kind of primary assumption and wrong assumption that these organizations make is that men and women are the same, when in fact, as we all know, men and women are in fact quite different. And I'm about to kind of now do the entire kind of history of gender difference in 3 slides. So apologies to all the great scientists out there who've done this work. And I'm first going to reduce the work of one man, Simon Baron-Cohen, to 2 slides, who came up with a really interesting summary, I guess, of gender difference and a totalizing theory of gender difference. And he says that human beings make sense of the world in 2 fundamentally different ways: systemizing and empathizing. Systemizing being essentially a sort of analytical process. It's about looking at a problem, looking at a situation, looking at the system that is in operation within that situation, and trying to decode or deconstruct or understand the underlying rules in order to therefore control the system ultimately. And then there's empathizing, which is a word that people are probably a bit more familiar with, which is about putting yourself into the shoes of other people in order to feel what they're feeling and to experience what they're experiencing. And the payoff here is not about control, it's about emotional connection. And what he did, because he's a massive systemizer basically, was do a huge study of adults looking at their tendencies and preferences. And what he found is that on average, men will tend to systemizing, and on average, women will tend to empathizing. And those words are carefully chosen, on average. There is a spectrum, and most of us exist on that spectrum rather than at one end or the other. And there are many other pretty well documented differences between men and women, and this just looks like a list of sort of prejudices that I've made up when it's kind of put up like this. But I promise you, it's a very kind of nuanced and well-researched area, and you can look to the primary text to understand them in great detail if you don't believe me. But the summary, I guess, of the gender difference that we think is really helpful when understanding how and why to market to women is that the masculine will tend to have an interest in systems, whereas the feminine tends to be an urge towards people and empathy. The masculine tends to control, the feminine tends to connection. The masculine preference is to understand what is, whereas the feminine tends to try and understand what could be or what the possibilities are. The masculine tends to respond to new stimulus in a way that tries to justify or prove that what currently exists or the status quo is exactly the right thing to be doing, whereas the feminine will tend to play more of a devil's advocate role. The masculine preference in proof points is for argument, linearity, and the explicit, so the stuff that's on the surface rather than in the subtext. The feminine much more about feeling, meaning, and the implicit. And the survival instinct, and I guess the evolutionary theorists, there is the kind of great blanket kind of statements about how people go about passing on their genes, but there have been very interesting studies done now, I guess, in that field to say that actually the survival instinct is actually quite different in the masculine and the feminine. The masculine, I guess, in the kind of traditional received wisdom, being about fight or flight and using competition and scale to beat off those who are competing for their resources, whereas the feminine tending to respond to stress in a tend and befriend way and looking to reduce risk and look for safety. And then in organisation and structure, the masculine tends to be happier and more contented, and the default mode of preference tends to be around working independently and in a hierarchy, whereas the feminine tends to be more cooperative. So there you go. That's a whistle-stop tour of everything that's known about gender difference. But I guess more interestingly from our point of view is that it's not just people who have preferences. Corporate cultures have preferences too, because they're full of people, and they're often full of people who are quite like each other. So if you get lots of systemizers in an organization, they'll probably hire lots of systemizers, and then you end up with a systemizing organization. It's quite easy to tell a systemizing organization because they normally have massive receptions and lots of glass and chrome and have a logo which is a bull or a lion or something. But basically, systemizing corporate cultures look and feel a bit like this. And this will remind you, I guess, of the first point that I was making about financial services, automotive, booze clients and technology clients. But their core competence will tend to be about making or providing systems, or manufacturing, which is effectively a system which is constantly sort of bettering itself. The approach to customer relationships will be control, so it'll be about locking the customer in and locking competitors out. The organizational structure will be hierarchical or a series of hierarchies. They will only trust quantitative measurement, and they'll distrust nuance, grey areas, intuition, hunches, or anything like that. And they'll really enjoy measurement against previous performance. And retailers are really good at this, aren't they? It's always kind of, how did we do this day last year? Direct, almost day-to-day comparisons. And then the approach to surviving will be about size and scale. So they're often big penetration driving categories, which are all about kind of being number one, getting to be number one, having massive volume share effectively of the category. And they'll focus often on intra-category competition. And that's, I guess, classically automotive. You know, they care much more about the motor show than they do about the people driving the car, because all they care about is that new car has come out and it's got X, so we better get one too. And that's their sort of yearly, annual obsession. And that would be all fine if all that stuff stayed inside the organisation. But of course what happens is that corporate culture leaks out all over the advertising and all out of the external presentation to their consumers. And systemisers will tend to present exactly in the likeness of their corporate culture. So you'll find that they have a very strong belief in the machine. So the product will be the kind of supreme being in the advertising. And you rarely see people actually in arch sort of systematic advertising, but often the product is genuinely king. The orientation of the proposition will be self-centered. So it will start from the point of view of I am the company, I've got this amazing product, I'm going to tell you how magnificent my product is, and sort of argue with you until you believe it, with all the amazing proof points that I have. And new product development. I love the Gillette thing because it's so brilliant because it targets men, but it's brilliantly systematic. How many blades, or how sharp can a blade actually be? It's just sort of unthinkably sharp. But new product development will tend to be about taking an existing formula and just sort of endlessly edging it ever better with tiny kind of incremental changes, rather than those great sort of leaps, I guess, that one might expect from a more empathetic organisation. And the character of the relationship will be expert. So loads of jargon and process in advertising that comes out of systematic organisations, because that's the way they can prove that they know more than you, and you should therefore listen to them. And the intent in the communication will be very obviously about impressing you. So you see a lot of hyperbole in systematic communication. Automotive being the sort of best example of that, where the claims that they make seem, if you just sort of deconstructed the ad, it looks sort of risible. But the idea this person will travel thousands of miles just to get to sit in this car, or whatever it might be. But I like it makes you feel like the man you are, which is beautiful. But basically, the intent is to impress the customer into thinking that this product or this brand is absolutely amazing. And of course, that's great if you're talking to systemizers, but if you're talking to empathizers, if you're talking to women, it's profoundly off-putting and profoundly irrelevant. And that's why, all the well-published data about how women think and feel about automotive retailers, how they feel about automotive advertising, how they think and feel about financial services products. They're genuinely underserved by these categories because they're not serving women at all, and that's because effectively the culture is sort of militate against that happening. So what they should be doing is looking to the empathetic, and there are empathetic organisational cultures that they can learn from, and those will tend to be, and lots of agencies are like this, people service-based organisations where they have a very level relationship with the customer. Employees mirror the customer. John Lewis and Marx is a really good example of that, sort of nice middle-class ladies and gents serving nice middle-class ladies and gents. Teams and networks will be the primary organisational structure. You'll often have a visionary at the top of an empathetic organisation who will talk a lot about beliefs and purpose and why we're here and what we're here to do compared to our competitors. And the approach to surviving will be much more based on innovation They'll be quality-based, often looking for value share rather than volume share, and depth of customer understanding being the way that you facilitate that kind of loyalty. And empathizers, of course, present very differently to systemizers because they focus on all the things that machines can't do, which is beliefs, purpose, feelings, meaning, sensual stuff, kind of living in the real world, context, understanding how people actually use and might want to use these products. And they'll often behave as a person does rather than a corporation, so they'll have a much kind of smaller people-sized feel to them than a corporation would. And they'll seek to build connections with other people by mirroring the audience, so empathy being particularly critical. So they'll focus on and feature people, so Skoda, I guess, versus BMW. They'll mirror the customer very closely, and Nike has admirably done amazing work really understanding how women think and feel about their bodies and how they think and feel about sport, and mirroring that back at the audience in the work that they do, and share their interests. So they'll genuinely look at the audience, look at the category, look at what they have to offer, and then see where there is some sort of shared ground between them and the audience, rather than it being, I'm on this island, you're on that island, how can I kind of get you over onto my island, because that's where it's convenient for me to be. So they should be out there kind of looking to the empathetic, but of course the problem is that in the game of kind of rock, paper, scissors, what you find is that systemizing always wins in organizations, and the bigger they get, the more systematic they become, because numbers will always beat a hunch or a feeling, and because clarity beats nuance, and because fact always seems to triumph over belief. So it's incredibly difficult for these organizations to sort of get themselves out of the systematic mire that they have ultimately found themselves in. But that's my argument, and that is why I believe advertising does alienate women, and I don't think it's your fault. But I think that advertising is a symptom rather than a cause of the problem. But I think just raising awareness of what is actually going on within those corporate cultures with your clients can genuinely help change the way they do things.